I'm excited to have you all here. Thank you for coming. This is very important for us, very important for CSIS, very important for WIIS. And I want to welcome all of you and thank you for coming tonight. I especially want to thank Nina Easton for being with us tonight to moderate a discussion with these two remarkable women who've joined us from the administration. It was a little touch and go whether we were going to be able to get them tonight, and that's because they're both central figures in the policy pulse of this administration. And so, in Washington, that can change, quite abruptly. And but we were very fortunate that they were both able to come. We did lose Wendy Sherman, but that we understood, and this was, when you shoot for three of the biggest names in the government, we knew we were going to not get everybody. But we do want to say special thanks to our colleagues for joining us. My role here is strictly to introduce JoLynn Shoemaker, but I can't resist. I'm going to say just a few words if you'll indulge me. We've just hooked up with WIIS. WIIS is a 25-year-old organization, started off at the University of Maryland. And back when they were starting, this was a time when to be a woman in international security was a real challenge. There were not many women in the business. Matter of fact, I look out in the audience, I see some of the pioneers that were involved in this, but it was lonesome. There are a lot of the people here tonight that weren't even born when this was starting off, which is good, because I'd hate to have you have to endure the kind of restraints we put on ourselves back then. Why we thought it was better to deny ourselves 50% of the gene pool to run this country, I'll never figure out, but that's kind of where it was back then. And so when WIIS was first starting, it was genuinely needed to provide mentoring and networking opportunities for women. It was a lonesome field and challenging, and frankly, there were strong headwinds, to many women that were entering this field. So it was very important. Now the question is, what is WIIS doing now? What do we need it for now? And I can only give you my personal view. I mean, obviously, it's going to be up to you to decide this. And I've had many conversations with JoLynn about this. But I can only tell you some of my own personal views. I mean, we have an obsolete civilian personnel management system for this government. It's kind of a World War II blue-collar label, grind your way up from the bottom, start as a GS7, spend your 30 years to work up the system. That's our system. Well, think about what that means for trying to hire talented women in this era. Women that have so many more opportunities in the private sector than they did 30 years ago. And to say, oh no, you can't leave if you want to proceed. You've got to stay in this job, grinding away without any change for 30 years. Well, I'm sorry. I mean, there's a different calculus that enters the lives for women. Michelle will tell you about this. Several times, we've been the beneficiary because she came to CSIS for her family at one point in time. But yet our government personnel rules really don't accommodate that. Unless you come back as a political appointee, and that's a fairly thin veneer. We're cheating ourselves because we have obsolete personnel rules. And I would also say, and this is, I'll probably offend some people when I say this, but we are on the wrong track in this country on public government ethics. Because in essence, we're saying if you have had relevant experience, you're suspect. Right? If you know something, we probably don't want you in the government. This is crazy. This is absolutely crazy. Well, so if you want to have a career path for women, and women do need to be able to get in and out of the field because they've got family obligations, and sometimes that goes into the private sector, aren't our ethics rules starting to get in the way? I tell you they are. I mean, these are things we have to start thinking through. We've got a lot of work to do. So there's a big agenda in my mind for WIIS, and it's part of the reason that we wanted to host them here. I mean, this is an opportunity for us. We hope it's an opportunity for WIIS, and we're going to need everyone here. We're going to need all of your help because there's a lot more, and honestly, more structural and deeper, harder work in front of us. So, and that's why I want to say special thanks to these very talented women that would kind of launch us off. This is our first real experience. We've had a couple of private things, but this is our first big public thing. And it couldn't be a better way to do it. And Jolynn, let me turn to you. Why don't you get this started for real? Thank you. Everybody, thanks for coming.
Jill. Thank you so much, Dr. Hamre. I think it's just such an honor to be affiliated with CSIS, and of course we have strong linkages historically with CSIS, with Michelle and many other women who have been a key part of WIIS over the years, also being key parts of CSIS. It's also the beginning of our 25th anniversary, so it's a perfect time to have this kickoff event for our new chapter for WIIS, as I see it. I just wanted to say briefly that 2011, and I think so many of you in the audience know this, was a big transition year for WIIS, and so many people were really critical to that process. There are so many of you in the audience who really offered so much insight, advice, and support during the process, and I wish I could thank all of you from up here, but it would take up all of our time, so I won't do that. But I just do want to send a special thanks to my colleague Marie-Laure. Where did you go, Marie-Laure? Okay. Who's like the right hand of this operation, and I couldn't do anything I do for WIIS without her help. We're a team effort. So thank you very much for all you do. I'm just very pleased to see so many people who have such a long history with WIIS in the audience, as former board members, advisory council members, as supporters, and as friends and members, so instrumental to the organization's growth. And of course, I want to second Dr. Hamre's point about thanking both Michelle and Samantha for being here tonight with their very busy, both professional and personal lives. I'm also very thankful to those of you who are new to WIIS here tonight, and we really look forward to involving you in our programs moving forward. I just want to say a couple things about the WIIS mission. Our mission is to promote women's leadership opportunities in peace and security at all levels of their careers. A couple of important things about WIIS. We are global, we are inclusive, and we are unique because our community brings together many sectors. We bring together many expertise areas, many geographic areas, and many perspectives. And I think that makes us an incredibly special organization. We have about 7,000 people in our network. They're individuals and their organizations and institutions who share with us the mission and work towards the cause of women's full participation in peace and security. We provide a platform for elevating the perspectives, experiences, and voices of women, and most importantly, for supporting the next generation of female leadership that is so crucial to peace and security. We've played an incredible role in supporting the rise of women in this field over the years, and we really do celebrate these incredible accomplishments that I think are truly embodied by the women here on this stage tonight. But we must acknowledge there is much work to be done. The challenges we face globally cannot be tackled without the full participation of this talent pool. Unfortunately, we're losing women's contributions at many stages along the way, either through leaky pipelines or decision-making processes and cultures that continue to exclude or sideline the voices of women. Therefore, we must all work, those of us here today who care about this issue, collectively and diligently to close these gaps. It is my hope that you'll leave this event with a renewed dedication to this goal and assisting us in our mission, and I welcome all of your involvement and your expertise in all of our programs. I just wanted to make a quick housekeeping note. You each have cards on your seats, and we really welcome you to write down questions for the speakers tonight. What we're going to do for efficiency's sake is collect those mid-program, and then we'll try to choose some of those that we can ask with time permitting. It is now my pleasure to welcome Nina Easton. Nina, as many of you know, is an accomplished and well-known journalist. She is Fortune's Washington columnist and senior editor, and serves as a panelist and commentator on many news shows as well. Had previously worked for the Los Angeles Times and the Boston Globe, and is, of course, an author of an acclaimed political history as well. And we thank you very much, Nina, for taking the time out of your schedule as well and flying down from Boston to join us for this event. I'm going to turn it over to Nina, who has graciously also offered to introduce our speakers and to facilitate our discussion tonight. Thank you all once again, and I look forward to the next era for WIIS at CSIS. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Jill. And obviously, our speakers really don't need any introduction, particularly with this crowd. We are so honored to have both of you. Samantha Power, as you all probably well know, started as a journalist whose coverage of the Balkans conflict led to a Pulitzer Prize-winning book criticizing policymakers for not getting involved enough in trying to stop genocide. And that's become, I think, a lifelong passion of towards human rights. She's the founding executive director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School, where I have an office right now as in a fellowship.
Jealous.
And she's currently Special Assistant to President Obama for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights. Her title is much longer, but we'll leave it at that. And obviously, as we'll go into it, quite critical and central to much of the policymaking of this administration. Michelle Flournoy often has been touted as the, I hope she doesn't cringe too much, the likely next female Secretary of Defense. She serves as the Pentagon's really the chief policymaker, the highest ranking woman, and helped shape the administration's Afghanistan strategy. She served in a range of top defense positions under the Clinton administration, and in 2007 co-founded the Center of a New American Security. Center for, I'm sorry, I wrote that wrong, Center for a New American Security, which was a think tank credited, this is interesting, with really breaking new ground on counterinsurgency strategy, which I found quite interesting. Our conversation is going to range, we're going to talk about women in policy, but I also kind of want to show off these women and the policies that they're involved in right now and their leadership right now. I want to start with Samantha. You were part of something that came out in December, little notice, the National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. I had the honor of interviewing Secretary Clinton at the APEC Summit, and she gave us a brief overview of it, but it came out in detail without a lot of notice. Could you give us a good overview of that?
I can try. I think Michelle also, who is a huge champion of these issues, could speak to it. But basically what we have are a number of almost axioms about the way societies progress and don't progress. And one of the axioms, of course, is if women are left out of economic development, societies are more likely to stagnate. If women are left out of peace processes, those peace processes, it turns out, correlatively, are much less likely to succeed. And it turns out women who are part of those peace processes bring attention to the kind of sustainable issues, not merely ending conflict, but the kinds of reconciliation, health, welfare, sort of DDR, demobilization of soldiers. They just have attention, bringing attention to the long game. Women, of course, are often early warners of conflict to come. They see their sons, their husbands, et cetera, going off, or could be alarm bells in conflict prevention situations. So all these things we know, or we think we know. We need more empirical work, and CSIS is a big part of the solution, as is a new center at Georgetown that was just set up in conjunction with the release of the National Action Plan. But we in the government, and certainly our leadership, have made it very clear that we should have policies that act upon these axioms. In other words, if we know women should be involved in peace processes, let's get them involved in peace process. If we know that political transitions are more likely to endure if women are in the parliament or in the governing ministries, then our diplomacy toward Libya should reflect that. So we know all this, but prior to the president taking on this task and instructing the cabinet agencies and Secretary Clinton and Secretary Panetta and others and USAID Administrator Raj Shah, really embracing the bureaucratic implications of those axioms, is in a way it's left to chance. And so what the National Action Plan does and the executive order that accompanied it from the President is it has all of the agencies involved in foreign policy stepping up and saying, here's how we're going to change our training. Here's how we're going to change our diplomacy. Here's how we're going to inject a regard for sexual and gender-based violence into the mandates that we put before the UN Security Council. And so what you'll see, and I brought a little prop here, the National Action Plan. The National Action Plan, available on a website near you, has a series of very, very concrete commitments. And I would note, and this is again something Michelle can speak to far better than I can, but DoD is one of the best examples of how when you can get a set of presidential priorities, a set of strategic priorities into the DNA of the building, all kinds of things happen. It gets integrated into doctrine, into training. You will end up seeing, in planning guidance in some, theater of operations that we may not have had on our minds when we were developing this plan together. Suddenly it turned up that, well, we've got to have a gender advisor to the combatant commander, or we've got to make sure our soldiers out there as they train foreign militaries, bringing women and encouraging those foreign militaries to have units that comprise women as well as men, et cetera. So that's what the executive order does. It's a statement of U.S. policy, it's a statement of prioritization, and it's an effort to institutionalize the insights that many of the people here have been preaching for a long time, but to get them into the fabric of the way we do our business in the U.S. government.
And it raises the question, though, of how, particularly with cultural bias. And let's talk about Afghanistan. I mean, how could you see this moving forward in Afghanistan as one of the chief architects of the strategy there?
It actually has already had an impact on the ground. For example, one of the challenges in a society like Afghanistan is the separation of the genders, and that particularly if you have a predominantly male unit of soldiers, they're only interacting with the male half of the population, and the female side of the population is really sort of off limits in an Afghan culture to most of our soldiers. So one of the things that this work inspired was the creation of female engagement teams, where we actually train small teams of women to go in with a combat unit, female soldiers or Marines, and actually seek out the women in the village and talk with them. It's amazing what you learn.
These are female Americans.
Female American soldiers and Marines who go in and now focused on interacting with the women. It's amazing what you can learn culturally from an intelligence perspective, just a whole different perspective on what the needs of that area are, what's happening in that area, and the stresses and strains on the population and so forth. So it's been a really invaluable tool. At the same time, as we try to build capacity in the Afghan government, we've encouraged, for example, the development of female police officers, the development of female army officers, and so forth. Again, somewhat foreign concept for the Afghan security forces, but one that they too have seen the benefits of embracing this and being able to have members of their own security forces who can interact effectively with their female population. Another example of this is just sensitizing our folks on the ground to the need to bring women into community processes. I mean, traditionally Lloyd Jirgas, Shuras, these community gatherings where issues are worked through, in traditional Afghan society, those usually don't include women. One of the things that started to happen is that the recent Lloyd Jirga, for example, did included female parliamentarians, it included female activists, and so forth. And so, at first it's a sort of uncomfortable, awkward situation in a culture that's not used to that. But I think at the end of the 3 days of the last Jirga, without question, it was, I think, universally accepted as a really positive development, and that the participation of women brought a lot to the table.
So what kind of numbers are you seeing on police officers and military
It's still
officers
small
as women.
numbers, but it's a start.
And was there resistance? There must have been.
Well, it ranges. You know, the institutional resistance, I think, has diminished substantially. The real resistance is it's a foreign notion for the society. I make a point whenever I go to Afghanistan to seek out one of these units. And the last, I visited the police training center in Kabul this last time and met with all of the women recruits. And the stories varied from one woman who felt that had the full support of her family, as this is the most patriotic thing she could be doing for a new Afghanistan, to another woman who was completely disowned by her family because she was choosing to join the police force, as this is something that was so outside their realm of experience that they couldn't accept it.
Can you talk more broadly about Afghanistan and how you see, I know this is a broad question, but how do you see things playing out there and the role of the Taliban in particular?
Yeah. I think we're at a really critical juncture. The strategy review that President Obama undertook, and then the recommitment of effort and focus and resources, both on the civilian and military side, have enabled us to really make a lot of progress on the security side and shift the momentum. For the first time in 5 years, the level of violence in Afghanistan is down. The momentum has shifted away from the Taliban. They have not been able to regain key areas in the south and their sort of heartland, if you will. But it's created some security space. We've begun a transition process with handing over different areas to the Afghans for security lead. But the real critical juncture we're at now is that we've created space for something else to happen, and that something else really needs to be a political settlement within Afghan society. And that's where Afghan-led discussions with the Taliban, with other stakeholders in society, is going to be so critical to actually consolidating the security gains and charting a course for stability in the future.
So you see the Taliban as being part of negotiations and moving forward and talking with them and incorporating them into the process?
Yes, they're not a monolithic group. There are going to be some who choose to come and be part of the process and be reintegrated into society, and there'll be some who choose not to and will be dealt with, through, continued military pressure. But I think that process is going to be central to the outcome in Afghanistan.
Samantha, I wanted to turn to you about the Arab Spring. I mean, you were at the center of, at least according to news reports, the president's decision to intervene in Libya for humanitarian reasons, which was controversial. There were those who didn't want us intervening at all. There were those who thought that was a bad reason to intervene, a bad precedent. But you've got Libya and you've got Egypt, among a number of countries there. Egypt in particular, women who were at the forefront of the revolution are now, as Hillary Clinton put it, they've been out in the streets where they were protesting. They've now been humiliated and beaten and repressed, and not to mention just completely shut out of the decision-making process there. What's your overall prognosis for women in the Arab Spring? And again, broad question, but what's your thinking on that, and what role can the U.S. really play?
Well, first, just to take the opportunity, because I don't get out much, to correct the press reports. Turns out we have this amazing President Obama, who made these pretty amazing, and in the case of Libya, extremely brave decisions that resulted in saving so many lives. And just, it was a sight to behold, really, to see somebody step up. One of the things I documented in A Problem from Hell over many years, looking at many cases from time immemorial, really, was just that by the time we realized that the benefits of acting outweighed the costs, because there are always costs and there are always genuine risks, and by acting, the range of things you can do in different circumstances. But by the time we had that realization, it was too late. And I think President Obama, this spring, whether it was with regard to Egypt and the leadership and, drawing on the relationship that had been built over many generations with the Egyptian government, but also over several years with President Mubarak to try to get ahead of events there, or with regard to Libya, with Benghazi hanging in the balance and so much at stake. for him to lead the world in the way that he did and move beyond a no-fly zone to something that would really protect civilians on the ground. I mean, it really was remarkable, and like you say, it's not necessarily politically rewarding to do that, but I had the opportunity to travel with Ambassador Rice to Libya not long ago, and just, I mean, to see the level of just the effusive regard for this president, this country, the American people, you know, and the sense that America's on Libya's side, you know, through what will be a very, very difficult road ahead. We have a great head start, you know, because, and I point again to Michelle and the Defense Department's remarkable leadership in this very, very complex operation. But the dividend, you know, now lies ahead, and of course the overall success of the policy that was made in the spring will be judged over time, you know, both in terms of the answer to the question you posed about women, but more broadly about the durability of this democratic transition. In terms of women, I mean, I met, again, when I was there in Libya with a group of women leaders, and you definitely already had the sense of nervousness that things were slipping away, that look, there we were in Benghazi Square, you know, we were out there risking our lives. You know, women were supporting men in Tripoli as they rose up, and very much a part of that kind of remarkable operation and coordinated operation that ended up bringing about the fall of Tripoli. And they're saying, you know, but where is our place? By virtue of their advocacy, you know, they secured 2 ministries. I think they had hoped for more in this kind of transitional cabinet. They were very focused on the election law. And I think right now we have word that the election law allots 10% of the seats in the parliament for women. But there's some debate, and I think I just came from a meeting on this today about whether the 10% is a floor or a ceiling. And of course, our position is the constructive ambiguity that it's a floor, and only the beginning, you know, of the dialogue. But it's not our position.
A peek into the challenges you face.
Yeah, well, you know, so it'll be women advocates who, in the same way that they lobbied for, you know, some, again, pre-designated allotment, will now argue for a more maximal interpretation of the law. And there's a lot of interaction. I mean, you can already see the fruits of a society or of a transition in a society that not long ago, I mean, really not long ago, you got the death penalty for setting up an NGO. I mean, that was how repressive it was. So the fact that people have activated in this way doesn't guarantee outcomes, you know, that are consistent with the values that we're here to talk about tonight, but it's a precondition for that. And I think you see the leadership of the TNC and the transitional authorities really feeling like they have to cater to this community. It doesn't mean they're catering sufficiently or in the way that satisfies the demands of the women, but there's a definite sense that there's a constituency out there. And so that's already a kind of democratic ethos taking hold, that sense that you have to be responsive, that you're accountable in some fashion. With regard to Egypt, I can't say it better than Secretary Clinton, who I think just gave such a you know, a poignant, sort of issued a poignant appeal for the better angels to emerge there and for these issues to be taken, to be elevated and to be taken very, very seriously. But I would say, again, if you look at women's participation in the recent elections, participation as a whole was kind of jaw-dropping. You know, relative to the logistic challenges that you know, a society that hadn't done a free or fair election before, you know, I think that there were a modest number of irregularities. Obviously, we're very concerned about the treatment of women in the streets. But again, just as the Libya example underscores, I think, you know, as devastating as the treatment of women has been in some regards, the counter movement, the counter protest, the fact that those women came out and took to the streets and protested in that fashion, again, making their voices heard, you know, saying it wasn't just a change in the titular leadership of the society that we're talking about a change in business as usual. And so it's, you know, of course it's going to take time, but I think it's the fact, where we would have to start to be worried is if you started to see people disengaging and just sort of saying it's lost. Whereas in fact what you're seeing is people more and more activated every day, and reacting to the problems that are almost inevitably accompanying the transition.
Just one quick follow-up to that. Does our, what is it, $1.3 billion in military aid give us leverage on things like how women are treated, women's rights, or is it really you have to use the bully pulpit more?
Well, I think we use all the tools in our disposal. I mean, I think one of the amazing features of the U.S. response to the Arab Spring, and you know, I've only been in the executive branch for 3 years, so I don't have a vast well of government sort of analogous tales to draw upon, but in the Arab Spring, the degree to which the Pentagon, the State Department, the White House, the Justice Department, the Treasury Department, if they're going on economic missions, which is so important, everybody's singing from the same songbook. And so, you know, whether it's, General Dempsey in his consultations, the role of women is, very, very prominent in his engagement. And so the leverage that we have by virtue of that relationship, is something that, is accompanied by an attention to this set of issues. Same with the NGO issue, which affects women and men alike, the crackdown on NGOs and the suspicion, particularly of the American NGOs who've run into trouble, but also Egyptian NGOs who get less attention. Again, seeing all of the tools in the relationship, all of the history, and the bonds that have been built up by virtue not only of the military assistance, but the training and again, just the synergies that have existed over generations. Those are an advantage, in our diplomacy. Those are tools, I think, that help us, get a hearing in places we may not otherwise.
Did you have?
No, I would just add, I think because of some of these long-term security relationships with a place like Egypt, for example, since the Camp David Accords, we have very, strong military-to-military relationships, very clear and open channels of communication at the highest level. But they also have an experience dealing with us as a democracy. And they understand that these issues, the treatment of women, the treatment of NGOs, are very important issues in our democracy. And so when issues like foreign assistance requests, security assistance requests go to the Congress, these things do get connected. And I think the Egyptians in particular, who have a very long relationship with us and have gone through many, many legislative cycles to be beneficiaries of American aid, really do understand this. And so we have the channels and they have the experience to understand that these things really are related to one another as we think about the relationship we're charting going forward. And I think that the leadership has been very receptive to some of the messages that have been sent recently, and they are taking some steps to try to correct some of the missteps that have been taken.
Like what
like the treatment of the NGOs.
Yeah. Let's turn the conversation, since we have limited time, on the role of women. Foreign policy recently said what we all know, that women are woefully underrepresented in national security ranks at the very highest level. Which begs the question, why does it matter? I mean, obviously it matters to the women sitting in this room and their career paths, but why does it matter on outcomes? And I wanted to pose the question to both of you. Are women, including women in the highest level decision-making on national security issues, whether here or elsewhere, does that lead to a more peaceful society in your view? Do you really think women make a difference there?
You go first.
Well, I think I'd say a couple things. First of all, back to John Hamre's point, you want to fully avail yourself of the talent pool, if you will. And when women are underrepresented, you by definition are not accessing the full range of talent. And so just from getting the best quality people, the highest standards of excellence, the best people who are able to contribute to policy, to contribute to problem solving and all of that, you want to have women included in the pool as fully as men by definition. I think the question of outcomes, I think there's a lot of literature that suggests that the answer is that you do get a different outcome. What I'll just speak to from my experience, I think that the way in which people approach their positions, approach leadership, approach problem solving is very individually, it's very specific to the individual. But what I can say is in the Pentagon, for example, as we've gone from, when I first went there in 1993, we had a lunch for all the senior women in the building, and we were at one table. And then for the next 6 weeks, it was like, what were they talking about? The great conspiracy theory. Now, I mean, I would overflow out of the executive dining room in the Pentagon, which is a big room. There are a lot of women leaders. That said, there are a lot of women leaders kind of coming up and at the middle ranks, and there's still very few at the top. There's still ceilings to be broken. When we go into a leadership conference with the secretary and the chiefs and the service secretaries and the chairman and the COCOM, the combatant commands, more often than not, there's one woman at the table, maybe two. It's myself and a colleague, and out of this whole room. That's going to change over time. The thing that's been different is you've had a lot of women leadership at that middle level. For example, of our QDR. I was very proud. The first set of Quadrennial Defense Review briefings, first person stood up to brief the strategy, it was a woman, Kathleen Hicks. Next person stood up to brief Homeland Defense, it was a woman, Christine Wormuth. Next person stood up, and so on. There were 4 or 5 women leaders in the QDR process that I actually do think affected how the process was run. It was more open, it was more collaborative, it was more inclusive just by style, by virtue of their leadership. Now, whether that's attributed to their gender or to these individuals, I'm not a social scientist who can, make a conclusive observation, but I think that there was definitely a different approach that was influenced by the leadership of this handful of key women.
Which raises a personal question. Let's get personal with you. You're leaving, and one of the things that you cited was your 3 children. Mm-hmm. How much is the work-life, work-family balance an issue for women getting and staying at the top?
Well, I have a wonderful older mentor who once said to me, Michelle, you can have it all, you just can't always have it all at the same time. And I think, these jobs, and Samantha can speak to this, are incredibly demanding. They're 24/7, nonstop. I think for our family, the issue is that my husband's also serving. He's the Deputy Secretary at Veterans Affairs. So you have 2 parents of kids 9, 12, and 14 who were once 6, 9, and 11 when they started,
That's the problem.
Basically, had parents who were very, very committed and engaged in this, supporting this president. And at some point, just from a family perspective, something has to give. The good news is what I've discovered over my career is that there are many seasons and many chapters. There are many ways to do public service. It doesn't all have to be in government. It can be in government, and I hope I'm not done in that respect. I hope I do have future opportunities to formally serve in government, but there are many ways to contribute and to serve in a public service sort of way from outside government. And I'm fully committed to that path, and whether it's in a think tank or in mentoring programs or whatever, I will be finding my way in the future to continue on that path in some way.
Samantha,
but with a little more time to see.
With a little, I was going to say, they're at a critical age. Samantha, I didn't forget you on that question. You didn't want to answer at first. Women.
I don't want to answer any questions.
Women,
I've learned that.
Do you think women are inclusion of women is more likely to lead to more peaceful outcomes? And as particularly somebody who's covered, genocide and atrocities, and there are women in some of those decision-making roles. What's your overall perspective on that?
I'm very, not coincidentally, very much with Michelle in terms of just the individuated nature of the human condition and just believing. I mean, I remember as a kind of kid in my early 20s in Bosnia, one of the leaders of the Bosnian Serbs, there was this woman, Biljana Plavšić, and she was famous for kissing the warlord Arkan on the cheeks, and everybody took her, sort of plucked her out of context. You see women leaders too perpetuate ethnic cleansing, you know, as if it was itself sort of, you know, a whopping case sample. I mean, I think Michelle's point and John's point, right, which is we don't even begin to know. We don't have the case sampling. I mean, we've got these isolated examples, and, you know, for every Biljana Plavšić, you've got an Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and
Right.
and you've got what the Nobel Committee did, you know, this year, sort of affirming the role of women. So there's the intrinsic sort of good and necessity of people who represent half the population, and, you know, who are, just by virtue of being mothers and connected with education and health and so forth in different ways, by virtue of taking care of their families and so forth, you know, often in the home. I mean, that is a special sort of set of insights, but I think it's going to take us some time of really integrating women into these leadership roles to have a kind of empirical base from which we can draw, you know, conclusions. I will say that, you know, I worked on my own, I mean, much more in a line of work like yours, you know, writing and kind of doing, and there are all kinds of issues. People ask about women in journalism and women in academia, and there are versions of this conversation that occur everywhere. It is different being in a large institution. I mean, there, you know, the impact of having Michelle, you know, at the table, at the deputies, you know, for women like me, you know, is very profound and very inspirational. In the same way that for all of us, it's incredibly inspirational to see Secretary Clinton and Ambassador Rice and Secretary Napolitano, you know, duking it out at principals meetings with one another and with, you know, and I mean, it's the nature of the deliberative process. It's no, there's, you know, I can't even think of an issue that's had a gender alignment, at least that I've seen. So I don't think you can draw easy correlations in terms of where people would end up. But, you know, again, for all of the challenges that Michelle has described, which I think we're chipping away at, and again, mentoring begets mentoring, hopefully, you know, some of the societies, you know, that we're talking about, whether in the Arab Spring or, you know, in sub-Saharan Africa, you know, conflict-ridden societies, I mean, we're not just talking about the challenges that we face here with a pool of incredibly educated, capable women, and, you know, are they hitting glass ceilings, or do they have to leave the workforce, take care of families, are they welcome when they come back? We're talking about utter exclusion, you know, and so there, what we know empirically and just as a matter of, you know, common sense, is that, you know, we can achieve, you know, dramatic improvements with, you know, just you know, added weight, the weight of U.S. diplomacy, the weight of U.S. leadership, but also just a few individuals in those societies, which is where the leadership ultimately has to come from, can make such a profound difference in a short period of time. I mean, the difference that the Yemeni Nobel Prize winner has made to women, you know, to bringing women on out, you know, to the streets, I think is profound, and it's having a ripple effect across the Arab world. So telling those stories and highlighting those leadership profiles, I think, is critical. Yeah,
because there's a question here about to what extent do people in the U.S. government actually know about the National Action Plan, and certainly people in the public don't know about it. But I think, and so I was going to have you address that, but the same way that Secretary Clinton has made, I think, a terrific economic argument about integrating women into economies, you actually have studies out now that say if you integrate women in, it actually adds to your GDP. So she can go around and say to foreign leaders, if you include women, there's a self-interest in it. Yeah. So how do you make the self-interested case around the world for this? A, and B, how do you get people talking about this and not just like putting it on the shelf and, you know, moving on? Yeah,
well, we folded into the plan, and Rob Brzezinski is here, who is a detail. Michelle was kind enough to loan him to the NSC. He's our woman-in-chief, Rob, in coordinating these amazing people across the government's efforts with regard to the National Action Plan. But Rob and I would have, you know, these tortured exchanges. You know, I'd get this research that I'd say, well, where's the data? I mean, basically looking to be able to make the pragmatic case, not only externally, but also within our own government, right? You want to be able to, if there's any non-convert out there, you want to be able to sway them. And I'd get, you know, Rob would send me what, to my, you know, former academic eyes looked a little more like anecdote than, you know, empirical work. Not Rob's fault. But you know, it isn't, we have some of what we need, and what we did was we put all of the sort of greatest hits of the empirical work are in the plan as a complement to the actions that the different agencies are taking. But I mentioned earlier that Georgetown has, created the center, which I think they hope to make a hub for this kind of work going forward. And the funding from foundations has to follow. This is the long game, because over time, I think what I described as axioms in this country and in our policy process and in this administration, I think they are axioms at the high, at the leadership levels for sure, but they're not axioms in the world. And I think you need the data, but you also need to not walk away from just the intrinsic point that John and Michelle made, which is just, even if you didn't have data, even if it didn't correlate, they don't get to be excluded. So you start there, and then again, I think we've got good anecdote, and we're building toward good empirical work.
Michelle, how would you make the case?
Again, I think right now we are going on anecdote and experience, and particularly in places, first in Iraq, then in Afghanistan, in places like Libya, where we see the difference in terms of particularly societies emerging from conflict. You see the difference that the participation makes, and you may not be able to document it and prove that it's statistically relevant, but folks on the ground see the difference, and so they follow it as a best practice. But I agree with Samantha that part of what we have to do is build the body of work to actually demonstrate that this is the case, that it's not just...
We have a question here, and maybe you could address this just looking around at the women you've hired and so on. What are the examples of skills or traits unique to women that facilitate success in this field?
Unique to women. Again, it's hard to generalize, but one of the books I read in college that I still remember was written by Carol Gilligan, who's a famous psychologist who researched the development processes of young girls and young boys. And her thesis, which I think a lot of research has borne out, is that boys tend to develop by placing themselves in this is very oversimplified, so for those of you who are professionals in this field, really forgive me. But the layman's sort of interpretation is that boys develop, and the name of the game is sort of placing themselves in a hierarchy, whereas for girls, the name of the game becomes developing and placing yourself in a network. And as much as that may be stereotypical or oversimplified, there is a kernel of truth in there that I do think the women leaders that I see operating the Pentagon, more often than not, have an instinctive leadership style towards networking and collaboration. And they tend to be very good, not every individual, but they are more often than not very good at the collaborative stakeholder, getting participation, buy-in, drawing people into a process to feel ownership and so forth. I mean, the latest example that I just watched was the development of this new defense strategy, where you have, I think, unprecedented amount of buy-in from the senior leadership because of the very collaborative leadership style of the people who led it, two of whom happen to be senior women. Doesn't mean that you couldn't get the same result with some wonderful, talented male leaders as well. But I do tend to see that as an approach that more often than not the best of the female leaders in the Pentagon have. Do
you have advice for women in this room? You've been in a very male-dominated part of the male-dominated national security structure. Do you have any advice for the young women in this room on how to operate in that environment?
I guess I would say don't mind it. Be yourself. If someone asks you the really well-intentioned but dumb question, like, how did a nice girl like you end up in a place like this? Just sort of shrug and say, gosh, poor guy. And, smile and give a funny answer. But just sort of don't mind it. And do your best and show be excellent at what you do. And more often than not, that will turn to your advantage to say, wow, that person is really exceptional. They may end up noticing you more because you do stand out as the only woman in the room. But the name of the game is to not let the otherness of the environment, which will sometimes strike you like, here I am again as the only woman in the room, just to not mind it, and to just focus on the quality of your contribution and the quality of your work, and that will speak for itself, and that will create opportunities on its own.
And Samantha, you have a slightly different experience as somebody who rose to prominence outside the government structures. What's been your experience going inside, and any advice to young women in this room?
Well, I definitely agree with Michelle that I think that the more self-conscious one is about numbers, or even like having a chip of some kind, or fearing the worst, or that wouldn't help very much. I think it just would kind of raise the overall level of anxiety. I think what helps, and this I'd say to women and young women and men alike, is just knowing something about something. I mean, I think that the people who thrive in government are people who master their domain. They don't have to master every domain, but what you're there. I happen to love baseball, and I'm struck. And again, government is still quite fresh to me, and so I still have these epiphanies where I'm like, oh. But just the degree to which to get anything done in government, it's not. Occasionally there's but very, very rarely there's a home run that can be hit where the run gets scored simply by somebody doing something fantastic. Like, that would be perhaps like a peace negotiator scoring a peace deal, bringing an end to a conflict or something. It's exceedingly rare. Much more often, it turns on, one person hitting a single and the next person moving the runner over, and the next it requires, it's not just that collaboration makes for better product. Without collaboration and that kind of teamwork and that spirit, but everybody having a very precise domain and skill and chop, as they say in government, there is no product, or there is no output in the world. And I think, again, for men and women alike, I think a focus, this is hard in government, but a focus on output, on impact in the world as against inputs. Sometimes we at the end of the year, we go over what we've, in my tiny little office, smaller than Michelle's domain, but we go over what we've done for the year, and there is a distinction between what we've done or gotten the government to do, which is really important and arguably a precondition to potential outcomes. But the real measure of the work that we do in public service is the difference that is made in the world. And I think keeping an eye on that is very challenging. And I guess the last thing I'd say is just on the work-family balance. I had a baby when I got to the White House, not that minute, but my water broke in a very heated discussion on an issue that shall go nameless. No, it didn't. The problem is I didn't know anything about, like, I had watched the movies, and so I thought it was going to gush. But it turns out, like, water breaking comes in many different forms. So your water really
did break?
Yeah, absolutely. In a very heated...
I thought you were just...
In a heated policy discussion with a very prominent member of the administration. But he didn't know and I didn't know, so we were no worse for wear. But I kept working, of course, and I was like, God, it's not that hot in here. Like, why am I sweating? Like, what's... Anyway. Rob will tell me too much information as we... Where's Rob? Anyway, so, but to say that that's an example of the, and so when you go, you're supposed to go quickly after your water break, but I was like, working and typing and.
How far away were you from your due date?
I was like over it, 2.5 weeks, so early.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think it was the tension of the discussion that precipitated the birth of my child. Anyway, who's no worse for wear, it turns out. But when I got to the hospital, they're like, you should have come right when your water broke. And I said, well, but I didn't know exactly how water breaks because it had never broken before. Anyway, and was of course, you know, in the hospital on my BlackBerry finishing everything up and all the ways that, and then when I went back to work, having taken a leave, you know, the breastfeeding BlackBerry, you know, you can even do dual BlackBerry. I mean, it's there's an awful lot you can do in the way of multitasking. But
is there a pumping station?
There's all kinds of pumping.
There are many
in the White House.
Well, and that's the other thing about the Women's Network is the number of horrifying, he walked in on me while I was pumping stories that I heard upon coming back, you know, meant that I was like literally like in a safe, you know, a top secret safe, so nobody. But anyway, so there are these challenges. But the challenges, and this is where I have such, you know, both respect for Michelle for the sacrifices she made in being in the government for the ages of the children that she describes. The sacrifices only get greater as your kid grows up, you know, and so now I have this unbelievable nearly 3-year-olds, you know, who I just can't bear to part with, you know, in the morning and you know, run home at night to see, and that, so I think it only gets more and more pronounced. So thinking about the timing of how to go in and out, and it's not as if non-governmental life for people who work as hard as I'm sure everyone in this room and who are as committed to what they do is, you know, is somehow a cakewalk in terms of the work-life balance. But there is something about government now, having tasted a lot of different careers, that is unrelenting. There's something unrelenting, and I know I feel, you know, when I wake up in the middle of the night and I see the red light on the BlackBerry, and I just, you know, I just feel like it's going to be bad, and it's going to be my problem. It's not going to be anybody, you know, whereas as a columnist or something, I could make it Michelle's problem,
right?
You know, which was much more fun. And write on your own time and so forth. So I just, you know, I think you can't have it all, and you have to have it at different times. And I think, but you know, child rearing is not a monolith. You know, work is not a monolith. You know, there are different ways to think about how to sequence and how to stagger things. But you definitely, there is no. We're all kind of all-in people, and it's hard, you know, to feel as if you can't be all in one direction or the other. So something has to give.
Is it totally unrealistic, though, for the White House or, you know, upper echelons of state or defense to afford more flexibility in that, you know, you end up, you know, my work day I find is just so merged with my life. As a mother as well. I mean, but it doesn't mean you're in the office from boom to boom, but I don't know that is ever a realistic possibility for you guys.
I think it's very difficult in the White House, given the demands of, you know, the supporting the president and so forth. But I think in the agencies, you know, it really depends on the culture that's set in the organization. When I had my first child and came back and remarkably got promoted immediately after maternity leave, was the undersecretary at the time, Walt Slocum, bent over backwards to make a more flexible approach work for someone who was a deputy assistant secretary and dual-hatted as a principal deputy. And that was because of his enlightened leadership. And you know, we made it work for a while because he knew that making that work was critical to keeping me. One of the things I've done, following in his footsteps, is really put an emphasis on, within the parameters that Samantha described, which is very big jobs for a lot of people, trying to create more flexibility. So, for example, we've put a big push on alternative work schedule in my organization, and almost every office has adopted it, so that there is cross coverage of portfolios, and you know, when there is a lull, people feel like they can take some time, get, you know, a little bit of recharging their batteries with their family, and there's somebody's there to cover them and so forth. It's a work in progress, but it's amazing not only the difference it makes in morale, but when you invest in your people and their sort of quality of experience at work, you actually get huge jumps in performance. And all of the business literature says that. So it's worth making the investment. It takes management relentless management attention to try to make it work. But guess what? It's not just about making it more workable for the women. It's making it more workable for everyone. And the number of young men who are now taking paternity leave in the organization has gone way up. I mean, so it is. I think it's got to be a leadership focus, and it's got to be backed up at the highest levels. And one of the things I've had the blessing to have is two secretaries in a row that have been very supportive of this agenda and trying to make a very demanding workplace a little bit more family friendly.
I've watched President George H.W. Bush, President Clinton, President W. Bush, and this president come in saying, we're going to be different. We're going to be family friendly, and watching everybody I know just kind of disappear into the tunnel. Their families wonder where they went. I mean, is there any alternative?
I mean, I think there are a couple things, or maybe three things. One, Michelle has just described what's called, it's an old-fashioned word, leadership. Actually putting in place, using the position that she has, as such an influential position in the administration, to institute a set of practices that are going to, ease the burdens and the acute trade-offs that I think people feel, and that's incredibly important. I think there's a second dimension, which is psychological, and it's just liberating ourselves. I could leave the office in the day, and I mean, meetings permitting, but I don't.
You think people are going to be looking at you?
No, I don't even know if it's that. I mean, I think it's whether it's, some sense of what good girls do or what sense of what people. It's not so much about how other people would look at me. It's my own sort of, I guess, attachment to the work, sense of responsibility, sense of ethic. It's an old-fashioned ethic, and it's an anachronistic ethic, perhaps, but I think you could have, even as the kinds of leadership that Michelle has described, and there still has to be, women themselves have to liberate themselves and just do what they need to do in order to balance. But the third dimension is, let's not kid ourselves about what balance can look like. I mean, there have been like during the Arab Spring, we were all, I don't even know if we lived in the Situation Room, and that was, just very hard to be away from your kids. It just kept going, and then, it was great. It was one country after the other, but, you'd think that a country would sort of subside, and then the next thing you knew, and I had the height of the Libya crisis. It wasn't a deputies level meeting, but it was a meeting that was setting up the deputies. It was a very important meeting, and I attempted to do the phone call from home with my then 2-year-old, and the entire call, as I remember it anyway, was, "Mommy, stop talking. Mommy, stop talking. Mommy, not Obama time. Declan time." Not Obama time. Declan time. Over and over again. And I just couldn't. And here I was, trying. Again, it was a mess. And he was right. I was home, so it wasn't Obama time. Right. It was Declan time. Right. And there isn't enough Declan time, and so he had a point. So we could free ourselves, psychologically. We could have great leadership, and there's still just the fact that you got to be with who you're with. You got to be with your work and your commitments or your family and your commitments. So.
Well, it's also been somebody who's been familiar with putting the mute button on for the 3-year-old.
I was leading the call. I was leading the call. That was the challenge.
But I just wanted to thank you both for sharing some insights on policy, but sharing your lives with this audience. It's really appreciated. I think you've been a great source of inspiration. Thank you.
Thanks for doing this.
Thank you, Michelle, Samantha, Nina. We really appreciate you giving your time and your perspectives and your experiences this evening. And this is, I think, really the unique space that WIIS occupies, is really allowing for this kind of discussion that merges. Obviously, we want to shine a spotlight on all of the wonderful female expertise we have on international security, but at the same time provide this forum for talking about many issues that our younger women and our women coming up the ranks actually are asking about and wondering and often are struggling with and feeling isolated about. So I really appreciate your candor and your participation. We have a lovely reception for those of you who are able to stay, and we would love to continue the discussion and, of course, visit with all of you that we haven't seen in so long. So thank you very much, and we hope to host many future events and discussions here at CSIS. Thanks.